The autumn wind carried the scent of coming winter across the auction yard, where desperate souls gathered like leaves before storm. Sarah Mitchell clutched her daughter's hand tighter as the auctioneer's voice rang across the crowd, each word driving another nail into the coffin of her hopes. 3 months since her husband's death, 2 months since the bank had foreclosed, and now this, watching everything she'd ever loved reduced to lot numbers and starting bids. Lot 47, the auctioneer called, his voice cutting through the murmur of potential buyers. Fine breeding mare, 8 years old, gentle with children. Do I hear $20? Sarah's throat tightened. That was Buttercup, the mare David had given her on their wedding day. The horse had carried her through morning rides when hope still lived in their little homestead, had pulled the wagon that brought their daughter Emma into the world during that terrible blizzard 5 winters past. Now strangers examined her teeth and felt her legs like she was nothing more than horseflesh and profit. 25, called a voice from the crowd. 30, came another. Emma pressed closer to her mother's worn brown dress, her small fingers working the frayed edge of Sarah's shawl. At 7 years old, she understood enough to know their world was ending, piece by piece, bid by bid. Sarah smoothed her daughter's dark hair, the same shade as David's had been, and whispered words she didn't quite believe herself. "It'll be all right, little one. God provides for his children." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. If God provided, why had David died when the fever took him? Why had the banker, Mr. Harrison, smiled that cold smile when he told her the note was due in full, no extensions, no mercy for a widow with a child? Why had every door in town closed when she'd gone looking for work suitable for a woman with a small daughter to mind? Sold for $35 to the gentleman in the black coat. Sarah looked toward the winner and felt her blood chill. Thomas Garrett, the cattle baron's son, stood near the platform in his fine Eastern clothes, making notes in a leather-bound book. His pale eyes swept the crowd with the calculating gaze of a man who viewed human suffering as simply another business opportunity. Behind him stood 2 of his father's men, their hands resting easy on their gun belts, ready to collect whatever their boss had purchased. She'd heard the stories about the Garrett family. Old man Garrett had built his empire on the bones of smaller ranchers, using legal tricks and intimidation to force sales when honest negotiation failed. When that didn't work, there were always night riders, mysterious fires, cattle found dead in pastures. The law in these parts seemed to have a convenient blindness when it came to Garrett business, bought and paid for like everything else in their path. Lot 48. The auctioneer continued. Farm implements, plow, harrow, and sundry tools. Fine condition, well maintained. Those were David's tools, kept sharp and clean with the devotion of a man who understood that his family's survival depended on the soil and the strength of his back. She remembered watching him work them, muscles straining under his cotton shirt as he broke new ground for their first corn crop. He'd been so proud of that harvest, standing in the field with Emma on his shoulders, pointing out how straight the rows ran, how the ears hung heavy and golden. "Do I hear $15? 20. Thomas Garrett called out, not even looking up from his book. No one bid against him. Sarah noticed how the other potential buyers seemed to find their boots particularly interesting whenever the Garrett name entered the bidding. Fear had its own smell in the autumn air, sharp and bitter as greenwood smoke. The bidding continued through the remnants of their life. David's rifle went to Garrett for a fraction of its worth. The kitchen table where they'd shared 1,000 meals, where Emma had learned her letters, where Sarah had read scripture by lamplight while David mended harness, $25. Her grandmother's china, the only thing of value she'd brought to the marriage, disappeared into Garrett's collection for the price of a decent horse. Lot 61, the auctioneer announced, his voice taking on a different tone. The Homestead property, 160 acres with dwelling, barn, and outbuildings. Improved land with good water rights from Willow Creek. Sarah's legs nearly gave out. This was it, the moment that would steal the last piece of ground she could call home. Emma looked up at her with those serious dark eyes that had seen too much for her tender years. "Mama, where will we go?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But we'll find somewhere." The lies came easier now, worn smooth by repetition. She'd been telling herself the same falsehoods for weeks, ever since the banker had served the final papers. Somewhere was a beautiful word that meant nothing, when you had no money, no relatives, and no prospects in a world that viewed widowed women as burdens to be passed from one reluctant caretaker to another. Starting bid is $500, the auctioneer called. This is prime land, folks, good for cattle or farming. Creek runs year-round, and the title is clear. 500, Thomas Garrett said immediately. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. $500 was less than David had paid for the land 8 years ago, when they'd been young and full of dreams about building something lasting for their children. The improvements alone, the house they'd built board by board, the barn that had taken 2 summers to complete, the well David had dug by hand, were worth twice that. "Do I hear 600? The auctioneer asked, scanning the crowd hopefully. Silence stretched like a held breath. A few men shifted their weight, and Sarah saw the longing in their eyes. Good land was always in demand, especially with water rights, but the Garrett name cast its shadow over the proceedings like a thundercloud. No one wanted to cross the most powerful family in the territory over a piece of property, no matter how desirable. Going once at $500. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could she ask God for miracles when he'd already let so much slip through her fingers? Going twice. A new voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. $1,000. Every head in the crowd turned toward the speaker. Sarah opened her eyes to see a man she'd never laid eyes on before, tall and lean in the way of someone who'd spent his life doing hard work under an unforgiving sun. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his clothes, while clean and well-mended, had the practical cut of a working man's garments. Most striking were his eyes, blue as a summer sky, but with depths that spoke of sorrows weathered and wisdom earned the hard way. Thomas Garrett's head snapped up from his book, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied this unexpected challenge to his authority. 1,200, he said, his voice carrying a warning that most men in the territory would have heeded. The stranger never took his gaze from the auctioneer. 1,500. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Sarah felt Emma's grip tighten on her hand as the bidding war escalated beyond anything they'd witnessed that day. $1,500 was more money than most of these farmers saw in 3 years of good harvests. Thomas Shelton's face flushed red above his starched collar. $2,000, he bid out, and Sarah could hear the anger building in his voice. This wasn't about the land anymore. It was about respect, authority, and the unwritten law that said the Shelton family got what they wanted when they wanted it. 2,500, the stranger replied calmly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a sum that could buy a man a fine spread with money left over for stock and equipment. The color drained from Shelton's face, leaving him pale as winter frost. $2,500 was serious money, even for a cattle baron's son. His father might have questions about spending that much on a piece of ground that was worth half the price on its best day. "Sold," the auctioneer called, his hammer falling with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the suddenly quiet yard. "Lot 61 goes to the gentleman for $2,500. Sarah felt the world spin around her as the implication sank in. Someone had just paid an outrageous sum for her family's land, but that didn't change her situation. She and Emma were still homeless, still without resources, still facing a winter that promised to be harder than any they'd endured. The stranger made his way through the crowd toward the auctioneer's table, and Sarah got her first close look at him. His face was weathered but kind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as squinting into sun and wind. When he passed near her, he touched his hat brim in a gesture of courtesy that seemed as natural as breathing. "Ma'am," he said simply, and something in his voice made her heart skip strangely. She managed a nod in return, though her throat felt too tight for words. Emma peeked out from behind her skirts to stare at the man who just changed the course of their lives, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. As the stranger conducted his business with the auctioneer, Thomas Shelton approached, with his men flanking him like hunting dogs. Sarah instinctively pulled Emma closer, knowing trouble when she saw it walking toward her on expensive boots. "Mrs. Massey," Shelton said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "I'm sorry for your loss and your current difficulties. Perhaps we might discuss arrangements for your future comfort." Sarah had heard enough stories to know what arrangements men like Thomas Shelton offered to desperate women. Her spine stiffened, and she lifted her chin to meet his gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Shelton, but my daughter and I will manage." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid the world is harsh for women alone, especially those without resources. I could offer you employment, a position in my household. Your daughter would be well cared for, educated properly." The threat wrapped in velvet made Sarah's skin crawl. She'd heard what happened to the women who worked in the Shelton house, how they disappeared or turned up married to men they'd never met, shipped off to distant territories where questions weren't asked. As for children being educated properly, she'd seen the hollow-eyed youngsters who emerged from Shelton generosity, broken in ways that went deeper than physical harm. "No, thank you," she said firmly. Shelton's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his pale eyes. "I'm afraid I must insist. You see, my father has plans for this territory, and those plans don't include unattached women wandering about without proper supervision. For everyone's safety, of course." The men behind him shifted slightly, hands drifting toward their weapons. Sarah felt Emma trembling against her legs and knew they'd reached the moment she'd been dreading since David's death, the time when being polite and hopeful wouldn't be enough to protect them. The lady said no. The stranger's voice carried quietly across the space between them, but something in his tone made everyone freeze. He'd finished his business with the auctioneer and now stood perhaps 10 feet away, his hands loose at his sides, but ready for whatever might come. Thomas Shelton turned slowly, his face arranging itself into the kind of smile predators wore when sizing up prey. "This is a private conversation between me and Mrs. Massey. I suggest you move along before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." "I suggest you do the same," the stranger replied mildly. The ladies made her wishes clear. One of Shelton's men took a step forward, his hand settling on his gun, but, "Mister, you just bought yourself a piece of ground. Don't let it be your grave." The stranger's blue eyes fixed on the man with an intensity that made him stop mid-stride. "I've buried better men than you for lesser reasons. Question is whether you're fool enough to find out if I'm bluffing." Sarah had seen men face down before, but never with such quiet certainty. The stranger didn't bluster or threaten. He simply stood there like a mountain, immovable and patient, waiting to see what others would choose to do about his presence. Thomas Shelton studied him for a long moment, taking in details that Sarah couldn't read, but that seemed to give him pause. Finally, he stepped back with the kind of smile that promised future reckoning. "This isn't over," he said to Sarah. "Women like you need protection in this territory. One way or another, you'll have it." He turned and walked away, his men following like well-trained dogs. But Sarah knew enough about men like Shelton to understand that retreat meant regrouping, not surrender. Whatever protection she might need, it wouldn't be coming from him. It would be needed because of him. The stranger watched them go, then turned back to Sarah with a slight tip of his hat. "Ma'am, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. Sometimes a man has to speak up when he sees something that ain't right." "Thank you," she managed, finding her voice at last. "Though I fear you may have made an enemy today." He shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both resignation and resolve. "Wouldn't be the first time. Name's Jacob Stone. I just purchased your family's land, and I was hoping we might have a word about the situation." Sarah felt her heart sink. Here it came. The eviction notice, delivered more gently than Shelton would have managed, but no less final. She'd be turned out with her daughter to face winter with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and whatever few dollars the sale of their personal belongings might bring. "I understand," she said quietly. "When would you like us to leave?" Jacob Stone's weathered face creased into what might have been surprise. "Leave? Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't buy that land to turn you out. I bought it to keep you in." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, leaving her speechless and swaying on her feet. Emma looked up with wide eyes that reflected the same confusion her mother felt. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. Well, Jacob said, settling his hat more firmly on his head, that's a conversation that deserves more privacy than an auction yard provides. If you'd be willing, perhaps we could discuss the particulars over supper. I notice there's a decent-looking establishment across the street that serves meals. Sarah's mind reeled. A stranger had just spent $2,500 on her land and was now inviting her to dinner to discuss keeping her in her own home. It made no sense, violated every rule she understood about how the world worked, especially the part of the world where powerful men took what they wanted from those too weak to resist. Why? She asked simply. Jacob Stone looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that she recognized, the look of someone who'd known loss, who understood that sometimes life stripped away everything that mattered and left you standing in the ruins, wondering what came next. Because, he said quietly, sometimes a man gets a chance to do something right instead of something profitable. And sometimes doing the right thing is the only way to sleep peaceful at night. The autumn wind picked up, scattering the last of the day's warmth and carrying the promise of harder weather to come. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at this strange man who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to pray. All right, Mr. Stone, she said finally. Emma and I would be grateful for a meal and an explanation. As they walked across the dusty street toward the restaurant, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn toward something she couldn't yet name. Behind them, the auction yard continued its business of reducing dreams to dollars, but ahead lay possibilities she hadn't dared imagine just an hour before. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting everything the color of ripe wheat and distant hopes. The restaurant smelled of fresh bread and roasted meat, a welcome contrast to the dust and desperation that had filled the auction yard. Sarah guided Emma to a corner table where they could speak without drawing attention from the other patrons, most of whom were probably discussing the day's surprising events over their evening meals. The proprietor, a round-faced woman with kind eyes, brought them coffee and milk without being asked, along with thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. Jacob Stone settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to be mindful of his surroundings. His eyes swept the room once, noting exits and potential trouble, before settling on Sarah with that same steady attention he'd shown during the confrontation with Thomas Shelton. I reckon you've got questions, he said, wrapping his weathered hands around his coffee cup. Can't say I blame you. Ain't every day a stranger spends that kind of money on something that don't belong to him. Emma pressed close to her mother's side, eyeing Jacob with the wariness of a child who'd learned that adult conversations often meant changes she couldn't control. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair with one hand while studying the man across from them. The first question that comes to mind is why, Sarah said carefully. You don't know us, Mr. Stone. That land means nothing to you except as an investment, and you paid far more than it's worth. Jacob nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this line of inquiry. You're right about not knowing you personally, ma'am. But I know enough. I know you're a widow trying to raise a child alone in a territory where that's about as safe as walking through a wolf pack wearing fresh meat. I know the Sheltons have been buying up properties around here for less than they're worth, using methods that would make honest men ashamed. And I know that sometimes a man reaches a point where he's got to choose between profit and principle. That doesn't answer why you choose to help strangers, Sarah persisted. Men don't generally part with that kind of money out of Christian charity. A shadow passed across Jacob's face, and Sarah saw something there that made her think of David in his darker moments, when memories of the war would surface despite his efforts to bury them. Jacob was quiet for so long that Emma began to fidget, tearing her bread into small pieces and arranging them on her plate like tiny soldiers. I had a family once, Jacob said finally, his voice so low that Sarah had to lean forward to catch the words. Wife and 2 children, a boy and a girl not much older than your Emma here. Had a ranch up in Colorado, nothing fancy, but enough to make an honest living. There was a man there, lot like the Sheltons, who decided he wanted what we had. He paused to take a sip of coffee, and Sarah noticed his hands weren't quite steady. Whatever he was about to tell them had cost him dearly, and sharing it wasn't coming easy. Name was Morrison. had political connections, judges in his pocket, men who'd do his dirty work for the right price. Started by making offers on our place, reasonable at first, then less so. When we wouldn't sell, things started happening. Fences cut, cattle poisoned, our water diverted upstream. My wife, she got scared, wanted us to take whatever Morrison would give us and start over somewhere else. Emma had stopped playing with her bread and was listening with the intensity children brought to stories that might somehow explain the adult world's cruelties. Sarah reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, offering what comfort she could while her own heart began to race with dread at where this tale might lead. I was stubborn, Jacob continued, his blue eyes fixed on something beyond the restaurant walls. Figured a man had a right to keep what he'd worked for, that backing down from bullies just encouraged them to push somebody else around. Told myself I was protecting my family by standing firm, but truth was I was protecting my pride. The proprietor brought their supper then, beef stew thick with vegetables, cornbread golden and crumbling, butter yellow as summer sunshine. The warm, honest food seemed almost obscene in contrast to the darkness of Jacob's story. But Emma fell to eating with the appetite of a child who'd grown accustomed to uncertain meals. What happened? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer would break her heart. Jacob's hands tightened around his coffee cup until his knuckles showed white. Morrison decided that examples needed to be made. Sent his men to our place one night when I was in town getting supplies. Told them to burn us out, scare us into seeing reason. Don't think he meant for anyone to get hurt, just wanted to destroy enough property to make his point clear. He fell silent again, and Sarah could see the effort it took for him to continue. This was a wound that had never properly healed, a guilt he carried like stones in his pockets. Fires spread faster than they expected. Wind was up that night, and the house went like kindling. By the time I got home, he shook his head, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Found them in what used to be our bedroom, holding each other. Smoke got them before the flames did, if that's any mercy. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. Beside her, Emma had stopped eating and was staring at Jacob with a solemn understanding that sometimes came to children who'd witnessed their own share of loss. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry." Jacob nodded his acknowledgement, then straightened in his chair as if shaking off the weight of memory. Morrison never faced justice for what he did. Money talks louder than truth in most courtrooms, and dead ranchers' families don't make for reliable witnesses. I tried for a while to get the law interested, but it was like shouting at the wind. "What did you do?" Sarah asked, though again she suspected the answer would be complicated and possibly dark. "Left Colorado," Jacob said simply. "Sold what was left of the ranch for whatever I could get and started wandering. Figured I'd failed as a husband and father, might as well fail as a drifter too. Spent the better part of 5 years feeling sorry for myself and trying to find the bottom of every bottle between the Rio Grande and the Canadian border." Emma had finished her stew and was now working methodically through her cornbread, listening to every word while pretending to focus on her meal. Sarah recognized the behavior. Her daughter had learned to gather information about adult troubles without drawing attention to herself, a skill no child should need to develop. "What changed?" Sarah asked. "What brought you here?" Jacob smiled then, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "Met a preacher down in New Mexico, old circuit rider named Brother Samuel. Found me in a cantina in Albuquerque, 3 sheets to the wind and feeling sorry for myself. Instead of preaching at me about the evils of drink, he sat down and bought me another whiskey. That seems like an unusual approach for a man of God," Sarah observed. Brother Samuel was an unusual man. Told me he'd noticed I was working real hard at drinking myself to death, and he was curious about what I was running from that was worse than dying. So I told him. Whole sorry tale, start to finish. When I was done, he asked me one question that changed everything. Jacob paused to take another sip of coffee, and Sarah found herself leaning forward, genuinely curious about this turning point in his story. He asked me if I thought my wife and children would want me to spend the rest of my life punishing myself for their deaths, or if they'd want me to find some way to honor their memory by helping other families avoid the same fate. Simple question, but it cut through all the self-pity and guilt like a knife through butter. "And that's why you're here," Sarah said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Because you see parallels between what happened to your family and what's happening to mine." "More than parallels," Jacob said grimly. "From what I've observed, the Sheltons are using the exact same playbook Morrison did. Buy up properties for less than they're worth, using legal manipulation and intimidation to force sales. Anyone who resists gets pressure applied until they see reason or get broken trying to fight back." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping through the restaurant's windows. "You think they'll come after us directly?" "I think they already have," Jacob replied. "That little scene at the auction yard wasn't Thomas Shelton being neighborly. That was him letting you know you had two choices: accept his protection on his terms, or face the consequences of refusing it." Emma looked up from her meal with those two old eyes that had seen her father die and her home sold out from under her. "Are the bad men going to hurt us, Mama?" Sarah's heart clenched at the fear in her daughter's voice. "No, sweetheart. We're going to be fine." Another lie, smooth as river stones, but just as empty. Sarah was beginning to understand that her situation was far more dangerous than she'd realized. She'd thought the auction marked the end of her troubles, the final closing of one chapter, before she figured out how to write the next. Instead, it seemed she'd wandered into the middle of a much larger and more perilous story. "Mr. Stone," she said carefully, "I appreciate what you've done for us today, more than I can express. But I have to ask, what exactly are you proposing? You said you bought the land to keep us in our home, but what does that mean practically speaking?" Jacob set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "It means you and Emma can stay in the house you built with your husband. It means you keep working the land that's been your family's home. It means you don't have to face whatever the Sheltons have planned alone." "In exchange for what?" Sarah asked, because she'd learned that nothing in life came without a price, especially help from strangers. "In exchange for letting me help protect what should never have been threatened in the first place," Jacob said. "I've got money enough to keep the property taxes paid and make improvements as needed. I've got experience dealing with men like the Sheltons. And I've got nothing more important to do with the rest of my life than try to make sure another family doesn't get destroyed by greed and corruption." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. What she saw instead was a man who'd been broken by loss and was trying to rebuild himself through service to others. It should have been reassuring, but it raised its own set of complications. "People will talk," she said quietly. "A widow and a single man sharing property, even with the best of intentions. In a small community like this, reputation matters." "Let them talk," Jacob said with a shrug. "I've been called worse things than a man who helps widows and orphans. As for reputation, seems to me the Sheltons have built theirs on other people's misery. If helping you damages mine, I'll consider it a fair trade." Emma had finished her meal and was now leaning heavily against her mother's side, the day's events finally catching up with her small body. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair and tried to think through the implications of Jacob's offer. It was generous beyond belief, but it also tied their fate to a man they'd known for less than a day, a man who'd admitted to carrying his own share of darkness and regret. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is all happening so fast, and I have Emma to consider. Any decisions I make affect her future as much as mine." Jacob nodded, showing no sign of impatience or pressure. "Course you do. It's a big decision, and you'd be foolish to make it quick. Tell you what, why don't you and Emma come stay at the hotel tonight, my treat? Give you some breathing room to consider your options without worrying about where you'll sleep." The offer was so casually generous that Sarah felt tears threatening again. When had anyone last shown her such simple kindness without expecting something in return? "That's very generous, Mr. Stone, but I couldn't." "You could and you should," he interrupted gently. "I've got rooms already paid for, more space than one man needs." Besides, I'd sleep better knowing you and the little one were somewhere safe and warm rather than wondering where you'd ended up. Emma stirred against her mother's side and looked up with sleepy eyes. Mama, I'm tired. Can we go somewhere warm? The simple request from her daughter decided the matter. Sarah had been trying to make adult decisions based on pride and propriety, but Emma's needs came first. If Jacob Stone was offering shelter without strings attached, she'd be foolish to refuse. All right, she said. Thank you. We'll accept your offer for tonight, and I'll give you an answer about the land arrangement tomorrow. Fair enough, Jacob said, signaling the proprietor for the check. Hotels just down the street. Clean beds, decent food, and walls thick enough to keep out the cold. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Sarah noticed several other diners watching them with a kind of intense interest small communities brought to unusual events. By morning, everyone in town would know about the mysterious stranger who'd outbid Thomas Shelton and was now apparently taking Sarah Massey and her daughter under his protection. The evening air was crisp with the promise of frost, and Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around Emma's shoulders as they walked the short distance to the hotel. Above them, the first stars were beginning to show in a sky the color of deep water, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lonesome call of a night bird settling in for winter. Mr. Stone, she said as they reached the hotel steps, there's something I need to know. This morning, I was facing the loss of everything I held dear. Tonight, I'm being offered a chance to keep it all. It seems too good to be true, and in my experience, things that seem too good to be true usually are. Jacob paused with his hand on the hotel door, considering her words carefully. You're right to be cautious, Mrs. Massey. I'm asking you to trust a stranger with your future and your daughter's safety. All I can tell you is that I've got no interest in taking advantage of your situation, and every reason to want to see you safe and settled. But what if the Sheltons decide to escalate their pressure? What if helping us puts you in danger too? Jacob's smile was grim but determined. Ma'am, I've been in danger before. The difference is, this time I'm not running from it. As they entered the hotel lobby, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a story whose ending hadn't been written yet. Whether that ending would bring salvation or sorrow remained to be seen, but for the first time since David's death, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Dawn came cold and gray across the territory, with winter's breath already visible in the frost that silvered the hotel windowsills. Sarah woke to find Emma curled against her side like a kitten seeking warmth, her daughter's dark hair spread across the clean white pillowcase like spilled ink. For a moment, in the space between sleep and full consciousness, she almost forgot where they were and why. The bed was soft, the room warm, and the sounds filtering through the window were the ordinary noises of a town beginning its daily business rather than the harsh voices of auctioneers reducing lives to lot numbers. Then memory returned with the weight of stone settling in still water. The auction. Thomas Shelton's threatening smile. Jacob Stone's impossible offer. The conversation that had stretched deep into the evening, revealing truths that changed everything she thought she understood about their situation. Emma stirred beside her, opening eyes that held too much knowledge for 7 years on Earth. Mama, are we really going to stay in our house? Sarah smoothed her daughter's tangled hair, buying time while she considered how to answer. The night had given her space to think, but thinking and deciding were different creatures entirely. Jacob Stone's offer remained as generous and bewildering as it had seemed in the restaurant, but the cold light of morning brought its own set of considerations. I don't know yet, sweetheart. Mr. Stone made us a kind offer, but we need to understand what it means before we accept. He seems nice, Emma observed with the straightforward assessment children brought to adult complications. And he didn't try to hurt us like that other man wanted to. The simple truth of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her 7-year-old daughter had recognized the threat in Thomas Shelton's polite words and genteel manner, had understood instinctively that his offer of protection was really a promise of something far worse. When had Emma learned to read such darkness in adult faces? When had innocence been stripped away so thoroughly that a child could recognize predators wearing civilized masks? A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Mrs. Massey? It's Jacob Stone. I've got breakfast waiting downstairs when you and Emma are ready." Sarah called out her thanks and began the process of making themselves presentable for the day. Their clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in them, and she had no brush for Emma's hair beyond her fingers, but soap and water from the basin helped restore some semblance of dignity. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the conversation ahead and the choice that would determine not just where they lived, but how they lived. The hotel dining room smelled of bacon and fresh coffee, scents that reminded Sarah of mornings in her own kitchen when David would come in from the early chores with his face red from cold and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of honest work completed. Jacob sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, a habit she was beginning to recognize as ingrained caution rather than mere preference. He rose when they approached, pulling out chairs with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to respect women and children. "Sleep well?" he asked as they settled themselves, and Sarah heard genuine concern in the question rather than mere politeness. "Better than we have in weeks," she admitted. "Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Stone. Emma and I are grateful for the kindness you've shown us." Emma nodded seriously, then attacked the plate of eggs and bacon the proprietor brought with the focused intensity of a child who'd grown accustomed to her regular meals. Sarah watched her daughter eat and felt her heart clench with a familiar mixture of love and worry that had become her constant companion since David's death. "I've been thinking about your offer," Sarah said carefully, stirring sugar into her coffee to give her hand something to do. "It's more generous than I have any right to expect from a stranger, but I need to understand the practical details before I can give you an answer." Jacob nodded, cutting into his own breakfast with measured movements. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Sarah said simply. "How would this arrangement work? What would be expected of me? What happens if the Sheltons escalate their pressure? What happens if you change your mind or decide to move on? I have Emma to think about, and I can't make decisions based on hope alone." The honesty of her concerns seemed to please rather than offend him. "Fair questions, every one. Let me try to give you fair answers." He paused to take a sip of coffee, organizing his thoughts. "First, the practical matters. The land is yours to work as you see fit. Any crops you raise, any livestock you keep, the profits belong to you. I'll handle the taxes and major repairs, but the day-to-day operation remains under your control." "That seems overly generous," Sarah observed. "What do you get from this arrangement?" "A chance to do something right," Jacob said simply. "A chance to make sure another family doesn't get destroyed by men who think power gives them the right to take whatever they want. As for what happens if I change my mind, I won't. This isn't a whim or a temporary charity, Mrs. Massey. It's a commitment I'm making for the long term." Emma looked up from her breakfast, syrup on her chin and questions in her dark eyes. "Mr. Stone, are you going to live in our house too?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, carrying implications that made Sarah's cheeks warm despite the morning chill. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of Jacob's offer that she hadn't fully considered the social complications. "No, little one," Jacob said gently. "I'll be building my own place on the land, close enough to help if needed, but far enough away to give your mama her privacy. A man and a woman who aren't married can't share a house without causing talk, and your mama's reputation is important." The simple acknowledgement of propriety's demands eased some of Sarah's concerns, but raised others. "You'd spend your own money building a second dwelling just to help us? Mr. Stone, I'm beginning to think you're either a saint or touched in the head, and I'm not sure which possibility worries me more." Jacob's laugh was rusty, as if he hadn't used it much in recent years. "Neither one, I hope. Just a man trying to make amends for past mistakes by preventing future ones." His expression grew serious again. "As for the Sheltons, I expect they'll test our resolve sooner rather than later. Thomas Shelton struck me as a man who doesn't take rejection well, and his father didn't build an empire by accepting defeat gracefully." "What kind of test?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Could be anything. Harassment, property damage, legal challenges to the land sale. Men like that have a whole range of tools for applying pressure, and they'll use whatever they think will be most effective. Emma had finished her breakfast and was now listening with the grave attention she brought to adult conversations that might affect her small world. Sarah reached over to wipe the syrup from her daughter's chin, using the simple maternal gesture to ground herself in the moment. "And you're prepared to face whatever they might do?" Sarah asked. "Because once we accept your offer, Emma and I become part of whatever conflict follows. I won't put my daughter in danger for the sake of keeping our land." Jacob's blue eyes held hers steadily. "I understand your concerns, and I respect them. But consider this. You're already in danger. The Sheltons have decided they want your land, and they're willing to use whatever methods necessary to get it. The only question is whether you face that danger alone or with help." The truth of his words settled over Sarah like a weight she couldn't shrug off. Thomas Shelton's parting promise at the auction yard had made it clear that her refusal of his protection would have consequences. Whether she accepted Jacob's help or struck out on her own, she'd still be dealing with the same fundamental threat. "There's something else you need to know," Jacob continued, his voice dropping lower so that other diners couldn't overhear. "I spent some time last night asking questions around town casual-like. The Shelton family has been more active lately, buying up properties faster than usual. Word is that old man Shelton is planning something big, some kind of development that requires controlling large stretches of territory." "What kind of development?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "Railroad spur, maybe, or mining operation. Could be they've got government contracts that require specific land access. Point is, your property isn't just valuable to them, it's necessary. That makes them more dangerous, but also more predictable. They'll keep pushing until they get what they want, or until someone pushes back hard enough to make them reconsider." Emma slipped down from her chair and moved to the window, pressing her nose against the glass to watch the morning activity in the street below. Sarah saw her daughter's reflection in the window, a small figure in a worn dress, looking out at a world that had already proven itself capable of taking away everything she loved. "Mr. Stone," Sarah said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Are you doing this because you genuinely want to help us, or because you're looking for a way to settle an old score with men like the Sheltons?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won self-knowledge. "Both," he said simply. "I won't lie to you about my motivations. Part of this is about settling scores, about finally standing up to the kind of men who destroyed my family. But that doesn't make my desire to help you any less genuine. Sometimes the right thing and the satisfying thing turn out to be the same thing." The honesty of his answer was somehow more reassuring than noble protestations would have been. Sarah had lived long enough to know that pure motives were rare in the adult world, but mixed motives could still lead to good outcomes if the people involved were clear about what they wanted and why. "All right," she said, making the decision before she could talk herself out of it. "Emma and I accept your offer. We'll go home and try to make this arrangement work." Emma turned from the window with a smile that transformed her serious little face, the first genuine expression of joy Sarah had seen from her daughter since before David's illness. "Really, Mama? We can go home." "Really, sweetheart, we can go home." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that the home they returned to would be different from the one they'd left. Jacob Stone's presence would change the dynamic of their lives in ways she couldn't yet predict, and the Shelton threat hung over everything like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Jacob pulled her aside for a private word. "Mrs. Massey, there's one more thing you should know. I sent a telegram to Denver yesterday to a friend who works for the territorial government. Asked him to look into the Shelton family's recent land acquisitions, see if there's anything irregular about their methods." "You think they might be operating outside the law?" Sarah asked. "I think men who get used to taking what they want sometimes get careless about covering their tracks. If the Sheltons have been using forged documents or bribing officials, my friend might be able to find evidence of it. Legal pressure works both ways, and sometimes the best defense is a good offense. The idea that the Sheltons might face consequences for their actions seemed almost too good to hope for, but Sarah had learned to be cautious about optimism. What happens if your friend finds evidence of wrongdoing? Then we take it to the territorial authorities and let justice run its course. But that's a long-term strategy, and we need to be prepared for more immediate challenges. The Sheltons won't wait for legal proceedings to play out before making their next move. As they walked back toward the auction yard to collect Sarah's few remaining possessions and arrange transportation to the homestead, she found herself studying Jacob Stone with new eyes. He moved through the morning crowd with the alert awareness of a man accustomed to watching for trouble, but he also showed genuine kindness to Emma, helping her avoid puddles and pointing out interesting sights along the way. The auction yard looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less ominous than it had seemed during yesterday's proceedings. Sarah's personal belongings had been boxed and stored in a small shed, waiting for collection by whoever had purchased them. Most of the items had gone to various townspeople, but Jacob had quietly bought back several pieces that held sentimental value. David's Bible, Emma's few toys, the daguerreotype of Sarah's parents that had been taken on their wedding day. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said as she recognized her treasures among the boxes. "Some things aren't meant to be scattered to the winds," Jacob replied. "A family's memories deserve to stay with the family." The simple gesture moved Sarah more than all his previous generosity combined. This man understood the value of intangible things, the importance of continuity and connection in a world that seemed determined to tear both apart. They loaded the boxes into a wagon Jacob had purchased along with a sturdy team of horses, practical animals that would serve for both transportation and farm work. As they prepared to leave town, Sarah noticed Thomas Shelton watching them from across the street, his pale eyes cold with calculation and something that might have been recognition. "He knows who you are," Sarah said quietly. Jacob followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "I figured he would eventually. Men like Thomas Shelton make it their business to know about potential threats, and I've never been good at staying invisible." "Will that make things more dangerous for us?" "Probably. But it also means we won't have to waste time wondering when the other shoe will drop. If Thomas knows my history, he'll understand that I'm not going to be intimidated or bought off. That should simplify the negotiations considerably." As their wagon rolled out of town toward the homestead, Sarah felt the weight of decision settling around her like a cloak. She'd committed herself and Emma to a path that might lead to safety and prosperity, or might lead to conflict and danger. Only time would tell which possibility would prove true. Behind them, the town grew smaller in the distance, but Sarah knew that the connections forged there, both friendly and hostile, would shape whatever came next. Ahead lay the land David had loved, the home they'd built together, and the uncertain future she'd chosen to face with the help of a stranger who'd become something more complex than a simple benefactor. The morning sun climbed higher in the pale autumn sky, burning off the frost and promising a few more hours of warmth before winter tightened its grip on the territory. Sarah pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and began planning the work that would need to be done before the snows came. The homestead looked smaller than Sarah remembered, as if the auction had somehow diminished not just their claim to it, but its very substance. The house David had built board by board stood sturdy against the autumn wind, its windows reflecting the pale afternoon sun like watchful eyes. The barn where they'd sheltered livestock through harsh winters waited empty, its doors hanging open to reveal the skeletal framework that had once held the promise of prosperity. Everything appeared exactly as they'd left it, yet nothing felt the same. Emma scrambled down from the wagon before it came to a complete stop, running toward the front porch with the boundless energy of a child returning to familiar ground. She paused at the steps, looking back at her mother with an expression that mixed joy with uncertainty, as if she needed permission to reclaim what had always been hers. "Go ahead, sweetheart," Sarah called. "It's still your home." The words carried more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Sarah was reassuring herself as much as her daughter, trying to believe that Jacob Stone's extraordinary generosity had truly restored what the auction had taken away. But as she watched Emma disappear through the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a situation more complicated than simple homecoming. Jacob unhitched the horses with the efficient movements of a man comfortable around livestock, checking their condition and ensuring they had access to water before unloading the wagon. Sarah noticed how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, taking note of sight lines, potential cover, and approaches that might conceal unwelcome visitors. The habit spoke of experiences she suspected she didn't want to fully understand. "It's a good piece of land," Jacob said as he lifted boxes from the wagon bed. "Your husband chose well when he settled here. Good water, soil that'll grow most anything with proper attention, and enough timber to meet your building needs. I can see why the Sheltons want it." Sarah looked across the fields where David had planted their hopes along with corn and wheat, where Emma had learned to walk among the furrows, where dreams of prosperity had grown tall before drought and illness cut them down like wheat before the scythe. The land held memories in every acre, but memories wouldn't keep them warm through winter or put food on their table. "David always said this place could support a dozen families if properly developed," she said, helping Jacob carry boxes toward the house. He had plans for irrigation systems, expanded crops, maybe even fruit trees if we could protect them from late freezes. But plans don't mean much when you're fighting just to survive from one season to the next. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face bright with the excitement of rediscovering familiar spaces. "Mama, everything's still here. My bed and the kitchen table and Papa's chair by the fireplace." Of course, everything was still there. The auction had sold the land and buildings, not their contents. But Sarah understood her daughter's relief at finding their personal world intact, even if the larger situation remained uncertain. Small continuities mattered when everything else was changing. They spent the afternoon settling back into routines that felt both natural and strange. Sarah began the process of restoring order to a house that had been left in the hasty disorder of people who'd expected never to return. Emma helped by putting her few toys back in their accustomed places, chattering constantly about things she'd missed and plans she was making for tomorrow's adventures. Jacob worked outside, making repairs to hinges that had loosened and checking the condition of the barn and outbuildings. Sarah watched him through the kitchen window as she prepared their evening meal, noting how he moved with purpose and competence through tasks that David would have approached the same way. But where David had worked with the satisfaction of a man building something for his family, Jacob worked with the focused intensity of someone preparing for conflict. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sarah of better times, Jacob knocked on the kitchen door and accepted her invitation to join them for supper. The meal was simple: salt pork, beans, and cornbread made from supplies they'd brought from town, but it felt like a celebration of homecoming despite the circumstances that had made it possible. "Mr. Stone," Emma said as they ate, "are you going to build your house close to ours?" Jacob looked to Sarah before answering, seeking permission to discuss plans that would affect them all. "I was thinking about that spot near the creek where the big oak stands. Close enough to be helpful, far enough away to give your mama her privacy. What do you think?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all adult decisions that might impact her small world. "That's a good place. You could see anyone coming up the road from there, and the tree would give you shade in summer." The casual mention of watching the road sent a chill through Sarah despite the warm kitchen. Emma was thinking like a child planning a playhouse location, but Jacob nodded as if she'd made a tactical observation. Perhaps, Sarah realized with growing unease, those were the same thing in their current situation. "I'll start clearing ground tomorrow," Jacob said. "Want to get the foundation laid before the weather turns. A man needs his own place, especially when winter's coming." "How long do you think it will take?" Sarah asked, though what she really wanted to know was how long she'd have to adjust to his constant presence before he became a permanent part of their daily landscape. "Month, maybe 6 weeks if the weather holds. I'm handy with tools, and it's not going to be anything fancy. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a stone fireplace. Enough to keep a bachelor comfortable and provide a base of operations for whatever comes next." The phrase "base of operations" hung in the air like gun smoke, Impossible to ignore despite everyone's attempt to pretend they were discussing ordinary construction plans. Sarah found herself wondering what kind of operations Jacob was planning, and whether she really wanted to know the answer. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at a pace too fast for casual travel. Jacob was on his feet and moving toward the window before Sarah had fully registered the sound, his hand settling automatically on the gun he wore beneath his coat. "Company coming," he said quietly. 3 riders, moving with purpose. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. In her experience, nothing good ever came from unexpected visitors arriving after dark. She moved to stand behind Emma's chair, placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders in a gesture that was part comfort, part protection. The riders pulled up in the yard with a jangle of spurs and creak of leather, their horses breathing hard from the fast ride. Through the window, Sarah could see Thomas Shelton flanked by 2 of his father's men, the same ones who'd stood behind him at the auction like trained dogs waiting for commands. "Mrs. Massey," Thomas called, his voice carrying the false courtesy that made her skin crawl. "I'd like a word with you, if you don't mind." Jacob moved away from the window, positioning himself between the door and Sarah's family. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "Let me handle this." "It's my home," Sarah replied, though her voice wasn't as steady as she'd intended. "I should be the one to speak with them." "It's your home, but it's my responsibility now," Jacob said firmly. "That was part of our agreement, remember? You don't face this kind of thing alone anymore." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his posture relaxed but ready. Sarah could see him clearly through the kitchen window, noting how he positioned himself to keep the 3 riders from getting too close to the house while maintaining his own mobility. "Evening, Shelton," Jacob said pleasantly. "Little late for social calls, don't you think?" Thomas Shelton's smile was thin as winter sunlight. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Thomas Shelton, and you're the mysterious Mr. Stone who caused such excitement at yesterday's auction." "Jacob Stone, and there's nothing mysterious about me. I saw something that needed doing, and I did it. Simple as that." "Simple," Thomas repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I imagine that's how it seems from your perspective. Unfortunately, Mr. Stone, situations in this territory are rarely as simple as they appear to outsiders." One of the men flanking Thomas shifted in his saddle, and Sarah noticed how his coat hung open to reveal the gun on his hip. These weren't social callers. They were a delegation with specific intentions, and those intentions didn't include pleasant conversation. "I'm a quick learner," Jacob replied. "What brings you out here tonight?" "Concern for Mrs. Massey and her daughter, of course. This is dangerous country for people who don't understand the local customs. Accidents happen to folks who make poor choices about their associations." The threat was delivered with the same polite tone Thomas might have used to discuss the weather, but its meaning was clear enough. Sarah felt Emma press closer against her legs, and she wrapped her arms around her daughter's shoulders. "What kind of accidents?" Jacob asked, his voice still conversational, but carrying an undertone that made the horses nervous. "Oh, the usual frontier hazards. Fires mostly. Amazing how quickly a wooden structure can burn, especially when the wind's up. And cattle can be destructive creatures when they get spooked and run through someone's crops. Then there are the more personal dangers, men with grievances, old debts that come due unexpectedly. A woman alone with a child is vulnerable to so many threats." Emma trembled against Sarah's side, and Sarah felt rage building in her chest like steam in a kettle. How dare this man threaten her daughter? How dare he stand in their yard and calmly discuss the various ways he might destroy their lives? Jacob took a step forward, and Sarah saw the change that came over him. Gone was the mild-mannered stranger who'd helped them at the auction. In his place stood someone harder, more dangerous, with eyes like winter ice and a stillness that promised violence. "That's interesting," Jacob said. "See, I've had experience with men who use fire and intimidation to get what they want. And I've learned that the best way to deal with such men is to make sure they understand the consequences of their actions." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Stone?" Thomas asked, though his voice carried less certainty than before. I'm educating you, Jacob replied, about the kind of accidents that can happen to men who threaten women and children. Amazing how quickly situations can turn deadly when you push the wrong person too hard. The tension in the yard stretched tight as a bowstring, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched the confrontation unfold. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the evening could explode into violence that would change everything. Thomas Shelton studied Jacob for a long moment, taking his measure with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. Whatever he saw in Jacob's face seemed to give him pause, because when he spoke again, his tone had lost some of its confident menace. This conversation isn't over, Mr. Stone. Mrs. Massey would be wise to reconsider her position before circumstances force that reconsideration upon her. The lady's made her choice, Jacob said firmly. And I've made mine. Anyone who has a problem with those choices can address their concerns directly to me. Thomas pulled his horse's head around with more force than necessary, causing the animal to dance sideways. We'll be seeing you again soon, Mr. Stone. You can count on it. The three riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving behind only the sound of hoofbeats fading into distance and the lingering scent of threat and gunpowder. Jacob remained on the porch until the sounds completely disappeared, then came back inside with the careful movements of a man whose nerves were still wound tight. "Well," he said, attempting to lighten the mood, "that was about what I expected." Sarah found her voice, though it came out shakier than she'd intended. "Is it always going to be like this? Living under the threat of what they might do next?" Jacob sat down heavily in David's old chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "Not if I can help it. But yes, there'll probably be more confrontations before this is settled. Men like Thomas Shelton don't give up easy, and they don't forgive challenges to their authority." Emma had been quiet through the entire encounter, but now she looked up at Jacob with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. "Are you going to fight them, Mr. Stone?" "I'm going to protect you and your mama," Jacob said simply. "Whatever that requires." The promise carried weight that went beyond mere words, and Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the man who'd so unexpectedly entered their lives. Jacob Stone wasn't just offering charity or seeking redemption. He was preparing for war. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we get ready," Jacob replied. "I'll start building my place tomorrow, but tonight I'll be sleeping in the barn, just in case they decide to test our resolve before morning." As they prepared for what might be a sleepless night, Sarah found herself thankful beyond measure for Jacob's presence, even as she worried about what his protection might ultimately cost them all. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of winter and the promise of harder weather ahead. The battle for their home and their future was just beginning, but for the first time since David's death, Sarah didn't feel like she was facing it alone. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, a widow, her daughter, and the stranger who'd chosen to stand between them and the darkness gathering on the horizon. Winter was coming, but so was the reckoning that would determine whether love and courage could triumph over greed and corruption in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American frontier.